You know that price tag on your coffee or your new phone? It seems pretty straightforward, right? But what if I told you it's not telling you the whole story? Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on the market's hidden costs and benefits, the side effects that shape our world, whether we see them on the price tag or not.
Look, every single day, we rely on markets for pretty much everything. And you know what? They're amazing at what they do. They take what we're willing to pay, what producers are willing to sell for, and they find that sweet spot, a price. And most of the time, that system works beautifully. But here's the catch. Sometimes, making or using a product creates side effects, costs that spill over onto people who had nothing to do with the original purchase. We're talking about costs to our health, to our environment, and these are the costs that are completely left off the price tag.
And that brings us to the big idea for today, an externality. Really, just think of it as a side effect. If that side effect is harmful, like pollution, we call it a negative externality. If it's helpful, like how your vaccine helps protect the whole community, well, that's a positive one. The most important part? The cost or the benefit lands on a third party, someone who wasn't buying or selling in the first place.
Okay, to really wrap our heads around this, let's start with the classic example of a negative externality. Let's call it the factory and the town.
So imagine you've got this factory making widgets. Business is booming. But to make those widgets is dumping waste into a nearby river. For the factory, that's great, free waste disposal. But for the town downstream, not so much. Their water is now contaminated. People might get sick. The whole ecosystem is damaged. That damage, that is the externality.
So let's break this down. The factory's price for its widgets only covers its own private costs, labor, materials, the usual stuff. But if you look at the right column, the true social cost is way higher. You have to add in the cost of cleaning up that pollution and dealing with the public health problems. Because the market price ignores all that, the widgets are artificially cheap. And that means the factory makes way too many of them and creates way too much pollution along with it.
So how in the world do you fix this? How do you get the market to actually see that true social cost? Well, the most direct way is pretty simple. You make the polluter pay up.
And we do that with something called a pollution tax. The fancy name for it is a Pigovian tax, named after this British economist Arthur Cecil Pigou, who came up with the idea more than 100 years ago. The logic is so simple, it's brilliant. You tax a company for every ton of pollution it creates. And just like that, the hidden external cost becomes a very real internal cost they can't ignore.
This sets up a really interesting choice for the factory. Okay, put yourself in the owner's shoes. The government just slapped a $50 tax on every ton of pollution you emit. What's your next move? Well, you're going to look at your options. If you can install a new filter that cuts pollution for, say, $30 a ton, that's a no-brainer. You do it and you save $20. You'll keep making those cheaper fixes until the cost of cutting one more ton is exactly $50. At that point, it's cheaper to just pay the tax. The market itself finds the most efficient way to clean up.
But a tax isn't the only tool in the toolbox. What if instead of setting a price on pollution, we set a hard limit on the total amount of it? This next solution is fascinating because it actually creates a whole new market out of thin air.
It's called a cap-and-trade system. First, the government sets a cap. That's the absolute maximum amount of pollution an entire industry is allowed to produce, period. Then, it hands out permits to each company. Now here's where it gets really clever. If a company invests in clean tech and pollutes less than its permit allows, it has leftover permits. And what can it do with them? It can sell them to another company that's having a tougher time cutting down its own pollution.
I mean, this quote really nails it. What the system does is turn the right to pollute into a commodity, something that can be bought and sold just like anything else. All of a sudden, being clean isn't just good for the environment, it's a valuable asset you can actually sell for cash. That's a powerful incentive to innovate.
So let's put these two big ideas side by side, because this is the key difference. With a pollution tax, the government sets the price of pollution. Then the market decides how much pollution happens at that price. With tradable permits, cap and trade, it's the exact opposite. The government sets the total quantity of pollution, and then the market decides what the price of a permit will be. Both are trying to get to the same place, just from totally different directions. All right, both of these solutions sound pretty solid in a textbook, right? But when we get to the real world, there is a huge challenge that makes a perfect fix almost impossible. Let's call it the information blind spot. Because just think about it for a second. If you're the one in charge, what is the perfect tax? Is it $50 a ton, $100? And if you're setting a cap, what's the right amount of total pollution? How do you possibly land on that perfect number that exactly matches the damage being done?
Yeah, to hit that bullseye, a regulator would need to know everything. The exact cost of the pollution damage, the exact cost for every company to upgrade its technology. They'd basically need a crystal ball. And the reality is, they almost never have that kind of information.
This leads to what economists call asymmetric information. It's a fancy term for a simple idea. One side knows a whole lot more than the other. Look at this table. The regulator has to guess how much it costs the factory to clean up its act. But who really knows? The factory does, down to the penny. And what's their incentive? Of course they have a reason to overstate their costs, to try and get a lower tax or a more generous pollution cap.
So, what are the real-world consequences? Well, when producers argue their costs are sky high, and it's hard for the public to put an exact dollar figure on, say, clean air, the outcome is pretty predictable. The tax often gets set too low, or the pollution cap gets set too high. We get closer to the truth, for sure, but that hidden social cost, it's still not being fully paid.
Okay, so we've been focused a lot on the bad stuff, the negative side effects, the pollution. But what's really cool is that this entire logic can be flipped on its head to help us encourage things that have hidden benefits.
And these are called, you guessed it, positive externalities. These are situations where the benefit of an action to all of society is actually way bigger than the benefit to the one person taking that action.
Think about getting a vaccine. Sure, you're protecting yourself, and that's great, but you're also doing your part to protect the entire community, especially people who can't get vaccinated. That's a massive positive externality, and it's the same with things like education and healthcare. We all benefit when we live in a society that's healthier, more educated, and more innovative. But here's the market failure on this side of the coin. Since we all make decisions based on our own personal benefit, we don't really factor in that huge extra benefit to society. And because of that gap, if you just leave the market alone, it will always underproduce these really good things. We'll get fewer vaccinations and less education than is actually best for everybody.
So the solution is basically a mirror image of what we do with pollution. To fix the bad stuff, we use things like taxes to discourage it. To fix the good stuff, we use tools like subsidies or even mandates to encourage it. This is exactly why governments help pay for education and roll out free vaccination campaigns. They're trying to close that gap.
So where does all this leave us? It shows us this fundamental tension, right? The market is an incredibly powerful engine, but it's blind to anything that doesn't have a price tag. And we've invented these clever tools to try and help it see, but our own lack of perfect information means those tools will never be perfect either. It's a central puzzle for anyone trying to make policy. And it's something to think about the next time you see a price tag and ask yourself, what is the real cost of this?